Alright everybody, we are moving on to our 10th and final unit in the AP Art History curriculum, Global Contemporary Art. I really like this unit because in terms of context, we have a better understanding of why people are making things and what kinds of materials they're using, and a lot of these people are still alive today to explain the methodology and the ideology behind their artwork. So a lot of you in this class are in visual arts. So I want people in visual arts, digital media, other visual arts oriented conservatories to think about their own art. Think about your art that is a physical thing that is going out into the world, potentially being seen and processed by others. For people in visual arts oriented conservatories, I want you to think about, why do you make art? What is your motivation behind it? A couple of you are pretty young. A lot of you might be in the same viewpoint of being like, well, I like making art because it's relaxing to me. It's a sort of like therapeutic aspect of my life. Some of you are creating artwork because of external motivations, like your parents put you in art class and you didn't hate it, so you're making art. Some people, though, create artwork because of other factors in their life. It could be personal history, it could be less personal history and how that affects the individual. It could be just another mode of expression. So why did you choose the mode of expression that you did, and how do you see yourself using it at your best? And most of all, like, who and or what has influenced you to think that way and why? So we are all motivated and influenced by context and history and other things that are happening around us right now and in the past. And we're going to see that as a common overarching trend with contemporary art. So for those of you who are not in visual arts or another visually oriented conservatory, when you go to a museum, I want you to think about how the way that you felt when you saw a certain work of art, the way that you remembered it, the way that you contextualized it, and so on. So again, I'll give you a moment to think about those sorts of things. So you can pause the video here to do that. All right. So in terms of like a general overview of global contemporary art, thankfully a lot of you already have the contextual information regarding global contemporary art because you were born in either the late 20th or the early 21st century. However, for this particular unit, we are starting from 1980 and we are going all the way to the present. So an important thing to remember is that since the 1960s, the media has been extremely instrumental in bringing global issues to the forefront of people's attention. So the invention of the television in particular was really instrumental in opening people's eyes to things that were happening, for example, during the Vietnam War. And that's actually one of the huge motivators behind these massive peace protests that were occurring, is that, like, back then the news didn't really censor itself, so there was actually footage of a man being executed live on television that sparked a lot of outrage. So even in areas and demographics that are not directly affected by an issue, you are seeing people that know about something, they're cognizant about something, and they are creating artwork in reaction to that. Artists in particular are pretty quick to pick up on social and political issues. You may have seen artists within your own community at OSHA that are using art as a way of providing commentary on social and political issues, and of course they've used these issues as a springboard to create their own artwork. We also have a lot of innovation in terms of materials and methods. So there's been pretty exponential growth in the fields of technology and materials in the past 50 or so years. And this has really facilitated the creation of multimedia pieces and expanded the possibilities of planning and construction. So some of you that have done 3D modeling online, you've probably heard of AutoCAD, which is this architectural program that has been extremely instrumental in helping architects plan these like larger scale, more intricate, and more organic buildings. Basically, it's a way where they can test stuff out without having to build a model first. It's also a way that they can check for errors prior to construction, and you don't have to go and basically hand draw everything and do hand done calculations. It's just extremely important in terms of creating these large, intricate buildings very quickly and very effectively and safely. In terms of sculpture and painting, we are seeing a lot of innovation in the world of plastics, as well as computer graphics and video projections. We also see lots of sound installations. There's a lot of installations, for example, that incorporate screens and televisions. Basically, any material that is somewhat forgiving and easily manipulated and modified has been used in contemporary art. I've seen people that have used their own blood and feces in creating artwork. Basically, in the art world, anything goes. All right. So, one of the things that I love about the Global Contemporary Unit is the diversity, not only in terms of the kinds of artwork that we're seeing architecture, we're seeing installation work, we're seeing paintings, we're seeing drawings, sculptures, but we're seeing diversity in terms of the people that are creating artwork as well. If you haven't noticed it already, one of the things that has kind of characterized a lot of the European units in particular is that basically the people that are creating artwork are heterosexual white dudes. We see a pretty radical shift in the last 50 years of art making where we're seeing women, we are seeing people of color, we are seeing queer people, we're seeing people with disabilities, we're seeing lots of different demographics producing artwork. And those artworks are widely recognized to the general public. For example, Kehinde Wiley, who is this artist that creates these awesome portraits that are based off of historical paintings, did the presidential portrait for Barack Obama. You probably remember the image of President Barack Obama where he's sitting on a chair and there's this ivy wall behind him. I highly suggest looking up images by Kehinde Wiley. He's a particularly prominent global contemporary artist. Unfortunately, he's not represented in the AP curriculum. So there's lots more venues and spaces that are also displaying artwork. We have public spaces for large installations. You've probably been to some sort of installation at least once in your life and probably not even noticed it. For example, the totem pole outside of OSHA's tower, I would consider an installation artwork. But a lot of work is becoming less exclusive and more public. You see lots of artworks that are being produced for galleries and public spaces for public enjoyment. A lot of these installations are similar to happenings, site art, and earthworks, in that a lot of them are manipulating the spaces around them. They are intended to involve audience participation. They challenge and reflect the environment in which they were made. We'll talk about this piece today, The Gates, which was this massive installation project in Central Park. A lot of artworks also emulate or appropriate elements of the past, oftentimes imbuing the work with additional meaning beyond what the artist intended. So again, for example, Kehinde Wiley oftentimes uses historical portraits as inspiration for his pieces, but of course you're seeing a person of color here instead of Napoleon. So this is lending additional meaning to this work. You're putting a person of color on a canvas, which is historically something that did not happen very frequently. He's also in plain clothes, which is lending additional meaning to meanings of power and prominence and basically what deserves to be in a portrait. A lot of pieces will use materials in a symbolic way, especially older materials. And then other pieces will recreate a classic work or reimagine a classic work with new materials and or from a different perspective. So there's lots of both like personal reflection and historical reflection that is happening in global contemporary art. So for example, in terms of reimaginings, you probably remember me showing you this video at the very beginning of the school year. And in terms of demonstrating how like a reimagining of an original work of art goes, this is a guy that basically did a violin cover of Apeshit by the Carters, and it's fantastic. This is an example of how like an original artwork is being manipulated to create something new but is still reflective of the original work. So I highly suggest watching this video, especially if you just want a little bit of a break. Our first work in the AP curriculum for Global Contemporary is The Gates by this husband and wife team, Christo and Jean-Claude. So this was a massive undertaking by this couple. They had planned the project for around 30 years, and I'll explain why. Basically, it involved millions of dollars worth of materials, as well as a lot of very difficult to obtain building permits. So this installation comprises of 7,500 of these 16-foot tall gates, which are basically these metal frames with a hanging saffron-colored cloth coming down from them. There's 7,500 of these, and they were arranged in such a way to go along the footpaths of New York City Central Park for about 23 miles. So the installation was first proposed in like the late 70s, and again, it took a really long time for them to finally realize the project in 2005. And what's interesting is that the project took so many years to plan, but it was only up for 16 days. And when it was up, it was all over the news. People were talking about it. Some people really liked it. And then a lot of talk show hosts were poking fun at it. The installation itself was extremely temporary, but it seemed to have a lingering impact on the people of New York City. So the project reportedly cost around $20 million. Christo and Jean-Claude have pretty significant reserves of their own. They make a lot of money by selling the plans and sketches and concepts for their projects. But there was reportedly an art collector that said, I want to buy 50 of these gates for myself, and they said no. So they could have paid off the entire project, or I don't know, like donated the money to charity or something, but if you're an artist, I guess. So they basically refused on the grounds that it violated the purpose of the work for it to be purchased. It was intended to be this public thing, and they talked about this notion that nobody can own this project, which is extremely pretentious. But again, contemporary artists are very conceptual that way. But the phrase that they used was, freedom is an enemy of possession, and possession is the equal of permanence. So they were talking about this concept of like, if somebody owns this thing, that makes it permanent, and it wasn't the purpose of this project to be permanent. It was intended to be temporary. And none of the gates were actually retained after construction. They were all recycled. So this is a clip from The Daily Show with Jon Stewart that talked about the artwork, and he called it, quote, piles of sheet. It's pretty entertaining if you want to go take a watch. There's lots of videos in this unit because, again, we have interviews from a lot of the artists. I highly recommend checking them out. One thing I will also do for our global contemporary artists is that I will give you a slide of other works by the artist, or in this case, these artists, to kind of give you a sense of like how they're using this material of fabric and installation, for example, to create these large-scale works. So in the 80s, Christo and Jean-Claude surrounded these islands in Florida with pink fabric. Of course, the environmentalists were not having it, and of course they were removed and modified pretty quickly. This was another installation that you've probably seen before, called Umbrellas. It was done in the 90s. There was one set of installations in Japan and then another set in California. The umbrellas were pretty massive. You can see them compared to the size of these dwellings over here. Unfortunately, they installed them in a lot of these areas that were gigantic wind tunnels, and unfortunately, one time, one of the umbrellas was blown over and actually killed somebody. So there's been lots of regulations and rules in place since the 90s to make sure that installation artwork isn't injuring and murdering people. Our next work is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's in Washington, D.C. If any of you have been to Washington, D.C., you might have seen this work along Independence Mall, which is basically this gigantic park in Washington, D.C. that's full of memorials and statues. You can see the obelisk back here, the Washington Monument, that's what it's called. So basically it's a gigantic park full of these massive installations and sculptures. So this memorial is a chevron shape. You can kind of see this long V. This is a Google Earth view right here, or rather a Microsoft view. Whoops. There's one arm that's pointing towards the Washington Monument, and then there's another pointed towards the Lincoln Memorial. So the monument is actually cut into the earth, as you can see with this image, and it's been lined with these slabs of black granite. So the granite is extremely reflective, so if you walk up to the monument itself, you can actually see a pretty clear mirror-like reflection in the granite. This is intended to be a method of like the artist incorporating the viewers into the sculptures by creating a reflection, and that's one of the ways that she's basically created a sense that the participants can see themselves in the artwork. They can look at this artwork and think, wow, it could have been me, or it could have been somebody I loved, whose name is on this wall. So this series of granite slabs basically indicates the names of 60,000 casualties of the Vietnam War in the order that they are declared missing or dead. So there's 60,000 names on the wall. You can kind of see the engravings here. The contrast isn't super great. So the color reflects an appropriate degree of somberness. Typically in the Western world, black is associated with mourning. And again, the surface is highly reflective so that the participant can see themselves there. So the monument was considered extremely controversial at the time it was made. Many objected to the dark color. They objected to the lack of ornamentation. Typically, when people go to a monument, they want to see an image of the thing that it's honoring. A lot of people objected to the fact that there wasn't like a sculpture of a soldier or a sculpture of a nurse or like another person that was involved in the Vietnam War. And eventually there were a couple of other Vietnam War memorials that were installed far enough away so that the wall didn't become like the secondary monument to whatever statue that would have been put here or here and whatnot. Maya Lin really insisted that this was intended to stand on its own and not be kind of like a backdrop to another sculpture. So Maya Lin was pretty heavily influenced by the minimalist movement of like not necessarily everything has to be like super showy and super literally interpreted. And again, that's one of the reasons why she insisted that this remain kind of a standalone installation. So Maya Lin has done lots of other installation type artworks in her lifetime, both outside and inside gallery spaces. I included this work because it has a lot of similarities to a couple of the other things that we've seen. So this is actually her signature, which I think is hilarious. Like, you're an artist and you have these massive resources, so you just sign your name into the earth. And it's called 11-minute line because it takes 11 minutes approximately to walk along the meandering edges of this line. You'll probably notice a lot of similarities to the Great Serpent Mound as well. So there's a lot of inspiration there. All right. Moving on to our third artist of the day. This is called Horn Players by JeanMichel Basquiat. So Basquiat was born in Brooklyn. He was of Puerto Rican and Haitian descent. As a teenager, he spent a lot of time tagging walls and subways under the name Samo. So Samo is basically an abbreviation of the phrase same old shit. So that was basically like his artist tag and moniker. He oftentimes used a three-pointed crown as a symbol for himself as well. He eventually emerged into the modern art scene with graffiti words as a trademark of his work. So what you'll notice when you look at this piece is that you're seeing the inclusion of images as well as written words. So basically, Basquiat would set up all of his artwork in a studio. He would be working on multiple works at once. And he would have a radio going, he would have the television going, and a lot of times these works are like streams of consciousness. He would hear a word on the television, or he'd read a book with a word, and he'd include the word directly in his paintings. A lot of times the words seem random, and like they don't really correlate to the subject. For example, ornithology is the study of birds, and you're like, I don't see birds here. It turns out that Charlie the Bird Parker, who was one of the individuals represented here, like that was his nickname, so that's why the word ornithology was included. We also have the jazz musician Dizzy Gillespie represented here. So you can see the word, where is it? There's Charlie Parker right here, and then Dizzy Gillespie is here. So the use of the black background is pulling the lines forward. This heavy contrast is creating an emphasis on these lighter areas in particular. So oftentimes these works resemble elements of graffiti and street art, which was particularly popular in the 1980s and 1990s in New York City. So unfortunately, JeanMichel Basquiat died of a heroin overdose when he was in his late 20s. So he was only about my age when he passed away. And we don't have much from him in terms of commentary on his own artwork. He tended to be pretty elusive to the press. He pretty much kept to himself, but he did have a couple of prominent artist friends. He had a pretty interesting relationship with Andy Warhol. There's a couple of great pictures of the both of them, like with crazy hairstyles. They were pretty good friends. Andy Warhol was also one of the people responsible for bringing Basquiat into the art scene. Here's a couple of other works. This piece right here, Untitled, is a massive piece, and it recently sold at Sotheby's for $110 million. So his work is, of course, extremely sought after in the art market, particularly because he died young and there's a limited number of his works. But one of the things that you'll notice that is a kind of a recurring theme in a lot of the work, besides the repeated imagery, is this layering of various elements. Like you have some stuff in the back that you can imagine he painted over and around as he like added to the painting. You also see lots of bodies. Lots of images of skulls, of heads. We even see a skull or head right here. And there's this great interview from one of his friends that talks about like how he had medical books in his studio, and he would oftentimes use those as inspiration for his pieces. So I highly suggest listening to this interview. It's relatively short. It was produced by Sotheby's in 2017 in association with this artwork to basically talk a little bit about Basquiat and what his life was like and what kind of world he grew up in.